I hope that everyone is in a receptive state of consciousness to take in the information at a very profound level of its significance, not simply at the level of the signifier, but to really go to the signified and beyond to the referent of the terms that we will be using to speak of that which cannot be described in language, but can only be pointed to metaphorically and analogously and with some descriptive elements of the byproducts of the practice. So the subject of the retreat is, as it's written on the board, the practice of self-mastery. I do not often use that term. In fact, I think it was many years ago that I last used that term in a teaching of a module. But it's a useful term, for one thing, because it's very popular, that I have discovered by doing a very simple online search with the term. But what I've discovered is that the use of the concept of self-mastery is now, for the most part, focused on becoming sufficiently disciplined to be able to achieve success in your worldly desires, to get what you want out of life as a person. But self-mastery from the perspective of Sat Yoga is very, very different. It's not about getting what you want. It's about transcending all wanting. It's about letting go, not about gaining something. I do have to say that for the most part, the serious essays and videos that I saw tend to take off from Stoic philosophy, one of the ancient Greek philosophies, most popular, especially by the Roman time, with Seneca and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, but going back to Epictetus and a whole tradition, a whole series of sages. But for all the virtues that Stoicism has, and it does have many virtues to teach, I think the most important of which is detachment, I think its virtues will enable one to live courageously in the world as a person and to face life and death, both, with courage and even with fearlessness, if one practices sincerely the teachings of Stoicism. But what it will not do is to take you to the realization that who you are transcends the level of being a person in a world. And that's where Sat Yoga comes in, because Sat Yoga is a continuation of the most ancient traditions of both East and West, but primarily of Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism of various non-dual schools, and of course the Shaivite wisdom schools of Kashmir, the non-dual schools, the Trika, the Kala, the Krama, and especially the Pratyabhigya and the reorganization and unification of all of those schools by the great sage Abhinavagupta, whose picture is actually still on the wall at the top, and he deserves that position. And Taoism, of course, and we will be offering an approach to self-mastery that is most easily understandable from any or all of those perspectives, in which we are dealing not only with being, but with nothingness, and with the non-duality of samsara and nirvana, of the immanent life in the phenomenal plane and the transcendent consciousness of the Absolute. What I have found through the hard experience of working with thousands of people over the years, but especially in this last period when the ego structure has morphed even into a greater density at the collective level, but also fractally for the individual, is that nearly everyone is quite content to settle for a slightly happier life as an individual person in the world. That's the goal. Let me be a happy person. Let me achieve some inner peace. Let me let go of my suffering, at least as much as I can let go of, and still be a person in the world. And the problem with having that paradigm and perspective is that most people, even when they have entered into the practice of yoga and the study of yoga philosophies plural, as in terms of the non-dual yogas, as well as the Vishishta Advaita yogas and Patanjali's classical yoga schools, which tend to begin by assuming that someone entering that wisdom school is in fact identified as a bodily person in the world living in duality or multiplicity. And there are very few who enter a school, or even long after they have studied in a school, transcend that frame of reference. And very few consider seriously letting the ego identity fall away forever and realizing God consciousness. It rarely even occurs to most egos as a possible reality to be attained, let alone one to be striven for with all one's might and one's heart and one's strength and one's soul. Very rarely does that happen. And so what that does is cause the ego that is not only satisfied with the non-transcendence into non-duality, but it is even rejects the possibility, actually doesn't want it, because they identify with the ego, and the ego doesn't want to die, it doesn't want to dissolve, It wants to sustain its identity and achieve its goals. And so even though the rapture of God consciousness, to anyone who thinks clearly about that option versus staying in the ego and trying to improve it or make it more sattvic or deal with life with more intelligence and virtue and whatever might seem to enable one to navigate the world of experience in a more healthy and positive way with less suffering, that's sufficient. But that will cause you to interpret the non-dual teachings from the imaginary register. And by interpreting them in that register of your consciousness, it will make the, let's call it attainment, or at least the return to our true nature, our full and complete nature as the consciousness that is God. It will make that into something that is felt to be a loss rather than a gain, a sacrifice and a submission. And it is true in a certain way that if you start out in duality and you wish to become one with God consciousness, because God will be perceived and conceptualized as the great other, the great spirit, the all-powerful Lord of life and death, that self-mastery will have to appear as self-surrender until non-duality is attained. Because the little false self identified with the body, in order to transcend that into the infinite consciousness, light, intelligence, power, deathlessness of your real self, that little self that's made of fear and desire and petty concerns, obsessions, and relationships of collusion and prejudice and projection, all of that will have to die. Your whole identity will have to disappear if you want to realize that you are God. And this is the obstacle that very few get beyond. So as I open this retreat, I made a lot of notes and haven't even had time to organize them, and I have no idea how many I'm going to be able to talk about. But it is the quality, not the quantity of information. But the first four threshold questions that I have for you, that everyone has to answer in order to even enter into this path, other than having an imaginary version of it. Because if you're in the imaginary, you'll either pretend you've already achieved it, or you'll create some imaginary proxy for it, or you will create some justification for why it's not really necessary and all is well with the role that you're playing in the cosmic drama, etc. But you really have to face at some point, usually in the middle of the night, and it can disturb your sleep until you've resolved it. Do I even want God consciousness? Do I want it? How many of you have actually confronted that question fully, head on? Okay. The second question, because what that means is you have not settled for living a life as an individual person in the world. You know that's false. You know the person is a fictional, crazy quilt of internalizations of the projections, fantasies, and desires of your family system and your social order and of the external other with whom you are mimetically enmeshed. So the question then, if you pass the first one, is how much do I want it? I can say I want it and I can be serious, but it still could be, okay, on the weekends, I'll meditate. This will be a nice hobby for me. How much do I want it? Because if I don't want it more than I want anything else, I won't get it. And then third question, am I willing to pay the price? Because it's a huge price. It's your entire identity. It will literally go up in smoke in the sacrificial fire. Am I willing to pay that price? And then the final question I think we all need to answer is, am I ready to pay that price now, in full? Not on an installment plan or a credit card, but in full, cash on the barrel. And God takes only gold, the golden light of the real. Am I willing to do it now because I know that it's now or never? Is there anyone who can answer all those fours with a yes, with a total haji? Keep it to yourself. It's not for me or anyone else to know. It's probably the most private and personal decision you'll ever make.